The 6th of June, 1944, a little after 7:30 in the morning, a stretch of the Norman coast that the German army had spent 2 years turning into the most heavily fortified shoreline on Earth. Inside a concrete gun position above the sand, a machine gunner is staring out through a narrow firing slit at a grey and heaving sea, and he is watching something come toward him that does not make any sense. He has slept badly. For days the weather has been foul, and the men around him have been told again and again that no army on Earth would attempt a landing in seas like these. Now, out on the water, perhaps a mile from the beach, there are shapes. They are low and dark and squat. They wallow in the swell, throwing up spray, and to the men in the bunkers they look like small boats. Landing craft, maybe. Something to be shot at, certainly. So the guns open up. Tracer reaches out across the water and strikes the shapes, and the shapes keep coming. They do not sink. They do not turn away. They crawl up out of the surf onto the sand, and then something happens that no briefing has prepared these men for. The sides of the boats fall away. Walls of canvas collapse down into the foam, and standing where the boats had been are tanks. Full battle tanks, guns already swinging toward the bunkers, firing from the edge of the water. Further along the same beaches there are stranger things still. There are tanks with a great spinning drum mounted out in front, and the drum is whipping the sand with dozens of heavy chains, beating the ground and where it passes. The mines that were meant to tear the attackers apart are blowing themselves up harmlessly in front of the machine, leaving a clean lane behind it wide enough to drive a lorry through. There are tanks that carry no ordinary gun at all, but a short, fat mortar that lobs a huge black canister the size of a dustbin at the face of a concrete strongpoint, and when the canister strikes, the blast is enormous and the concrete cracks. There are tanks that reach a seawall and unfold a bridge across it. There are tanks that lay a roadway of matting across soft clay so the vehicles behind them will not sink. And later, in that terrible morning, there are tanks that throw fire, long ropes of burning liquid reaching out more than 100 yards, pouring through the slits of the strongpoints until the men inside come out with their hands in the air. The gunner cannot explain any of it. His officers cannot explain it. The doctrine he was trained on, the doctrine that told him exactly how an enemy would try to cross a beach and exactly how to stop him, contains nothing that accounts for a tank that swims, a tank that flails, a tank that throws a dustbin full of high explosive. And the man responsible for this whole sector of coast, a professional soldier of 51 named Wilhelm Richter, who commands the German division holding these beaches, will spend the rest of that day reading reports he cannot fit together, and he will spend years after the war trying to understand what happened to his men on the morning the strange tanks came out of the sea. Hold on to that question, because it is the one this story exists to answer. Not simply what those machines were. We know what they were. The question is why they existed at all. Why it was the British who brought a swimming tank and a flailing tank and a fire-breathing tank to that beach, while the Germans, who had built the finest tanks of the war, who had all but invented the modern armoured breakthrough, who were by almost every measure the most sophisticated military engineers on the planet, had nothing to answer them with. This is not really a story about tanks. It is a story about two ways of running a country at war, and about what one of them could imagine that the other could not. This is the story of the machines the soldiers called Hobart's funnies, and of the men who dreamed them up, and crewed them, and in many cases died in them, on the longest day of the war. To understand why a German soldier could not explain the tanks on the beach, you first have to understand what the Germans believed a beach was for. And to understand that, you have to look closely at the thing they built along the coast of Europe, because on its own terms it was magnificent. They called it the Atlantic Wall. In theory it ran from the north of Norway all the way down to the border with Spain, more than 2,000 miles of coastline, and along the stretches that mattered most it was a genuine feat of engineering. It was built largely by a vast state construction organisation, the organisation TOT, using enormous quantities of reinforced concrete poured into standardised designs, worked out to the last centimetre. Gun casemates were angled so that their openings faced along the beach rather than out to sea, so that an attacker could never fire straight down the barrel at them. Fields of fire interlocked, observation posts, shelters deep enough to ride out a naval bombardment, all of it the product of a culture that took engineering more seriously than almost any other, and was rightly proud of the fact. In the autumn of 1943, the defence of the whole northern coast was handed to a commander whose name still carries weight, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the general the British had learned to respect and to fear in the desert. Rommel looked at the Atlantic wall and decided it was nowhere near strong enough. He threw himself into the work with the restless energy that had marked his whole career. Under his direction, the coast was sown with mines on a scale that is hard to picture. Historians estimate that somewhere between 4 and 6 million mines were laid in the months before the invasion, and Rommel wanted many times that number. He packed the beaches with obstacles designed to rip the bottom out of a landing craft or blow it apart, steel frames, ramps, stakes hammered into the sand at an angle with mines lashed to their tips, so that a boat riding in on a rising tide would drive straight onto the charge. In the fields behind the beaches, where he expected gliders and paratroops, he had poles planted and wired together, obstacles his own soldiers nicknamed Rommel's asparagus. And Rommel had a doctrine. It was clear, it was consistent, and inside the frame he was thinking in, it was correct. He believed the invasion had to be stopped at the water's edge. He believed that once the Allies got ashore and pushed inland, their overwhelming strength in the air and in supply would make them impossible to throw back into the sea. So everything had to be committed to that first thin strip of sand. He said as much to his staff. The first day of the invasion, he told them, would be decisive. For the Allies, and for the Germans alike, it would be the longest day. There was a fierce argument inside the German command about how to fight that day, and it shaped everything that followed. Rommel wanted the powerful armoured reserves, the panzer divisions, held well forward, close to the coast, so they could smash a landing on the first morning before Allied air power and naval guns could pin them in place. His superior, the elderly and highly respected Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, disagreed completely. Von Rundstedt wanted the panzers held back, gathered inland as a great central reserve, then flung forward in a single crushing blow once the Allies had fully committed. Both men had a coherent case. Neither got what he wanted, because the dispute was settled by a compromise imposed from the very top, and the compromise satisfied no one. The panzer divisions were split. Some were pushed forward, others were held back under the personal control of Hitler himself, so that they could not even be moved without his direct order. On the morning of the invasion, only one armoured division was close enough to the eastern beaches to intervene quickly, and the orders to release the others were tangled in delay and hesitation, while the most important hours of the war slipped away. The Germans had superb tanks and superb crews. What they lacked, on the day it mattered most, was a single agreed answer to a simple question, and that failure of decision sat on top of a deeper failure of imagination that we're about to see on the beaches themselves. Here is what the German defenders believed about how a beach would be attacked, and why their belief was reasonable. They believed the enemy would come in unarmoured landing craft, and that the men inside would have to cross the open sand on foot, through the obstacles, through the minefields, through the wire, under the interlocking fire of machine guns and the flat fire of anti-tank guns sweeping along the beach. They believed that tanks, if any came at all, would be landed at the water's edge from special craft, that they would arrive late after the infantry and in small numbers, because everyone knew that tanks were heavy things that sank in water and bogged down in soft ground. They believed that a fortified concrete strongpoint, properly built and properly manned, could hold against infantry for a long time, because there was no obvious way for a man on foot with a rifle to destroy a bunker whose walls were several feet of reinforced concrete. 3 beliefs: tanks cannot swim, minefields cannot be crossed quickly, concrete cannot be broken by anything that arrives on the beach in the first wave. 3 beliefs, and the whole system of defence rested on all 3 being true. On the 5th of June 1944, all 3 of them were true. The Germans were not fools. Their assessment was not madness. It was based on the best evidence anyone had, drawn from the entire experience of the war so far. The Germans even had a test case, and it had told them exactly what they wanted to hear. Almost 2 years earlier, in August of 1942, the Allies had thrown a large raiding force against the French port of Dieppe. It had been a disaster. The raid had included Canadian tanks, Churchill tanks, meant to support the infantry, and the tanks had struggled on the shingle and been stopped, and the whole force that got ashore, some 29 machines, was lost, abandoned on the beach and taken by the Germans, with about half of them still largely intact. Some of those Churchills were unusual variants. A few carried an early crude flamethrower conversion, and several were fitted to lay a roadway of matting across soft ground. German engineers hauled them away and studied them closely. And the lesson the Germans drew from Dieppe was the lesson that confirmed everything they already believed. A landing against a defended coast could be crushed at the shoreline. Armour could not get across a fortified beach. The answer was simply to build the wall higher, thicker, deeper, and to trust the concrete. Their model worked because it had imagined every threat that fitted the model. It failed because it had not imagined the man in the English back garden, the sacked general, and the foreign engineer, who between them were about to make all three of those beliefs false on the same morning. The German picture of the beach was not wrong about the beach as it had always been. It was about to be roughly 18 months out of date, and the men who were going to make it out of date were, almost none of them, the sort of men a tidy, rational army would ever have chosen to listen to. To break the three beliefs, you needed two things that the ordinary machinery of an army does not easily produce. You needed a set of frankly bizarre inventions that no committee would ever have asked for, and you needed a commander stubborn enough and strange enough to gather them all into one place and build an entire division out of them. Britain, as it happened, had exactly the right awkward, half-rejected men for both jobs. Start with the swimming tank because it is the strangest idea of all, and because the man behind it was not a British officer at all. He was Hungarian. His name was Nicholas Straussler, born in Hungary in the 1890s, an engineer of real brilliance who had settled in Britain and worked with British motor and armaments firms through the 1930s. Straussler had been turning over a problem that most soldiers would have dismissed out of hand. How do you make a tank float? A tank is a sealed steel box weighing around 30 tons. It does not float. Everyone knew that. And that certainty, that a tank cannot cross open water under its own power, was one of the three pillars the whole German defence rested on. Straussler's answer was so simple it sounds like a conjuring trick, and yet it works, and it works because of a piece of physics that any child in a bathtub understands. An object floats if it pushes aside a weight of water greater than its own weight. A bare steel hull the size of a tank does not push aside enough, but if you could raise the effective sides of that hull, if you could build a wall upward all around it so that it displaced a far larger volume, then the very same 30 tons of steel would float. So Straussler designed a collapsible screen, a wall of waterproofed canvas held up by metal hoops and by rubber tubes filled with compressed air. Raised, the screen stood up all around the top of the tank like the sides of a canvas boat, and the tank floated down inside it with only the screen showing above the waves. That is why, to the men in the bunkers, the shapes in the water looked like small boats. They were tanks wearing a canvas boat around themselves. To move through the water, the tank turned two small propellers driven off its own engine. This second drive, the drive for the water, on top of the tracks for the land, gave the machine its name, the duplex drive tank, duplex meaning two drives. To everyone who used them, they were simply the swimming tanks. When the tank reached the shore and its tracks bit into the sand, the crew let the air out of the tubes, the canvas screen dropped down around the hull, and suddenly, where a boat had been, there stood a fully armed tank with its gun ready to fire. The whole design was tested in secret, first on a small light tank on a reservoir north of London in the summer of 1941, watched by senior officers who could scarcely believe their eyes, then developed onto larger tanks, and finally onto the American-built Sherman, chosen because it could keep its main gun pointing forward, ready to fire the instant the screen came down. In the end, more than 690 of these swimming Shermans were built in Britain for the invasion. There was one flaw in the swimming tank, and you should hold it in your mind because it is going to matter terribly before this story's over. The canvas screen was never built for a rough sea. In calm water, in waves no higher than about a foot, the swimming tank was reliable. In a real sea, with waves of 4, 5, 6 feet, the water could pour over the top of the screen, and a swamped swimming tank did not limp home. It went straight to the bottom and the men inside had only seconds to escape before it dragged them down. Remember that. The sea on the 6th of June was not calm. Learning to crew one of these machines took a particular kind of nerve because a swimming tank is, for the men inside it, a steel coffin that happens to be floating. The crews trained in secret, over and over driving a 30-ton tank down a ramp into open water and trusting a wall of canvas and a few tubes of compressed air to keep them alive. They were taught to escape from a sinking tank using early underwater breathing sets, because everyone understood that if the screen failed, the tank would go down at once, and there would be no time to think, only time to act. Men died in training. It is a hard thing to accept that soldiers were killed rehearsing for the invasion in the calm water of a home bay, months before they ever saw a German, but they were. The crews who climbed into those tanks on the 6th of June knew exactly what could happen to them, because they had watched it happen to friends. Their courage was not the hot courage of the charge. It was the cold courage of the man who lowers himself into deep water inside a sealed steel box on purpose, knowing the sea that day is far rougher than the sea the box was ever meant to face. Now the second thing you needed, someone to see that a swimming tank, a flailing tank, a bunker breaking tank and a fire-throwing tank all belonged together in one specialised force, and someone with the rank and the sheer stubbornness to build that force and drive it to the beach. That man was Major General Sir Percy Hobart, and the story of how he came to be in a position to do this is one of the most extraordinary in the whole British Army of the Second World War. Because 2 years before the invasion, the British Army had thrown him away. Percy Hobart was born in the summer of 1885 in the hills of northern India, the son of a British official there. He was educated at an English school and then at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, and he was commissioned as a young officer into the Royal Engineers. He fought in the First World War, in France and in the Middle East, and he was a brave man. He won the Military Cross in 1915, and later the Distinguished Service Order as well. But the thing that set Hobart apart came afterward. In the 1920s, he moved into the brand new business of tank warfare, and he became one of the sharpest, most original minds anywhere in the world on the question of how armoured forces ought to fight. He built and trained Britain's first permanent tank brigade. He drove his men relentlessly. He worked out, years ahead of most of his contemporaries, how massed tanks moving fast and deep could tear an enemy apart. In Egypt before the war, he trained the force that would grow into one of the most famous armoured divisions in British history, the Desert Rats. Here is the bitter irony at the heart of the man. The people who studied Hobart's ideas most closely, who read what he wrote and took it most seriously, were German. The generals who built the armoured spearheads that smashed through France in 1940, the men who created what the world would soon call the Blitzkrieg, were working along lines Hobart had helped to pioneer. It is sometimes claimed, though the evidence is thin, that the great German panzer leader Heinz Guderian took an interest in Hobart's writing. What is certain is that the German army as a whole learned the lessons of massed armour that men like Hobart had been urging, while Britain's own army was slower to listen. His own army decided it had had enough of him. Because Hobart was, to put it plainly, extremely difficult. He was abrasive. He was impatient with men slower than himself, which was most men. He did not hide his contempt for officers he thought were fools, and he made enemies steadily and thoroughly among exactly the sort of senior people who write the reports that end careers. And in 1940, on the strength of hostile assessments, and with the acting authority of a senior general, Percy Hobart was removed from his command and pushed into retirement. One of the finest armoured minds Britain possessed was put out to pasture in the very year the German panzers, using ideas he'd helped to shape, overran Western Europe. What Hobart did next tells you something about the country he served. He did not sulk in obscurity. He went home to the small town of Chipping Campden, and he joined the local volunteers who were forming up to defend Britain against the invasion everyone expected, the men who would become the Home Guard. And this retired Major General, this man who had commanded thousands and trained a famous division, enlisted as a Lance Corporal. A Lance Corporal is about as junior as a soldier can be. On paper, at that moment, he was one of the most junior men in the entire British defence establishment, drilling with a scratch unit of local volunteers. There is a relic of this period kept today at a British tank museum, a homemade pike, an old bayonet welded onto a length of scaffolding pole, the kind of improvised weapon the Home Guard cobbled together in the desperate summer of 1940. It is a small monument to how far Hobart had fallen. He might have stayed fallen, except that Britain, for all its faults, had cracks in its system through which a discarded talent could sometimes climb back. A well-known military writer and thinker, Basil Liddell Hart, who understood exactly what the army had thrown away, wrote a piece in a Sunday newspaper more or less shouting that the country was wasting its best brains. It was read at the top, and the man at the very top, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, stepped in directly. In a letter written in October of 1940, Churchill defended Hobart against the officers who had discarded him. He argued that a nation fighting for its life could not afford to reserve its senior commands only for men who had never ruffled anyone's feathers. The country, he said in effect, needed its difficult original men precisely because they were difficult and original. Over the objections of the very people who had sacked him, Percy Hobart was brought back. He was recalled in 1941 and set to training the 11th Armoured Division. Then, in 1942, he was given command of the 79th Armoured Division, and in 1943 that division was remade into something entirely new, a formation of specialised armour told, in effect, to solve the problem of the beach. If you have ever had someone tell you that your best ideas were unwelcome, if you have ever been shown the door by people who turned out to be wrong, hold that thought. And if this story is landing for you, take a second to press the like button, because it genuinely helps these men and their machines reach more of the people who ought to know about them. The 79th Armoured Division was unlike any other formation in any army on either side of the war. Most armoured divisions were built to fight as a single fist, all their tanks driving together toward one objective. The 79th never fought that way. It was never meant to. It was a holding formation, a great pool of the oddest and most specialised armoured vehicles anyone had ever conceived. And its job was to lend those vehicles out, a squadron here, a troop there, to whichever ordinary formation needed a particular trick performed on a particular day. It wore on every vehicle a distinctive sign, a black bull's head with flaring nostrils on a yellow triangle, and by the end of the war this one division controlled something close to 7,000 vehicles. The soldiers of the rest of the army looked at its bizarre collection of machines and gave them a name that has stuck ever since. They called them Hobart's funnies. Let us walk through them, because each one broke one of the German beliefs, and each was a small triumph of exactly the kind of improvised, slightly mad engineering that Britain produced so well. You have already met the first, the swimming tank, which broke the belief that tanks could not cross water. It meant that armour could arrive not after the infantry, but with them, or even ahead of them, in the very first minutes, guns firing from the water's edge at the exact moment the defenders least expected to face a tank. The second machine broke the belief that a minefield could not be crossed quickly. It was called the Crab, and it was a Sherman that kept its ordinary gun but carried, on two long arms out in front, a heavy rotating drum. Fixed to that drum were 43 lengths of chain, each ending in a heavy fist of metal. When the drum spun, at around 140 revolutions a minute, those chains beat the ground ahead of the tank ferociously, and any mine they struck simply blew up in front of the machine rather than under it. The Crab could beat a clear lane about 10 feet wide through a minefield while crawling forward at little more than 1 mile an hour, and it carried cutters that tore through barbed wire as well. It was slow, and it was ugly, and it was deafening, and it turned the deadliest part of the beach into a lane you could drive down. The third machine was, to my mind, the cleverest of all, and it broke the belief that concrete could not be broken from the beach. It was a heavy Churchill tank, and the men who crewed it were engineers, so the whole vehicle was called the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. In place of an ordinary gun, it carried a short, fat, ugly spigot mortar that fired forward. This weapon threw a charge of about 40 pounds of high explosive, a distance of roughly 80 yards. The projectile was so large and so strangely shaped that the crews nicknamed it the Flying Dustbin, because that is very nearly what it looked like, a dustbin lumbering slowly through the air. It did not need to be accurate at any great range. It needed only to crawl up close to a strong point and slam an enormous demolition charge into its face, or into the seawalls and obstacles that blocked the beach exits, and blow them apart. The crew was 6 men, 5 of them engineers, working a vehicle that was as much a mobile demolition team as it was a tank. But the engineer's tank was far more than its mortar, because it was built to carry, drop and deploy a whole series of devices for crossing the obstacles that were not concrete but ground. It could carry a great reel of matting stiffened with wooden and steel poles and unroll it across soft clay or sand so the vehicles behind would not sink. This device was called the bobbin. It could carry an enormous bundle of brushwood and timber and drop it into an anti-tank ditch to fill it so tanks could cross. This bundle was called a fascine, an old word for exactly such a thing, used in siege warfare for centuries. It could carry a folding bridge and lay it in seconds across a 30-foot gap, or lean it against a seawall as high as 15 feet so tanks could climb over. There was even a version of the Churchill with its turret removed that would drive down into a ditch and simply become a bridge itself, a living ramp for the tanks to drive over the top of, and this was called the Ark. Every one of these devices existed to answer a specific obstacle Rommel had placed on the beach. and the fourth machine was the one the German infantry feared most of all. It was another Churchill, and it kept its ordinary gun, but where its front machine gun should have been there was instead the nozzle of a flame projector. Behind it, on a heavily armoured trailer weighing more than 6 tons, it towed 400 gallons of thickened jellied fuel and cylinders of compressed gas to force that fuel out under pressure. This tank was called the Crocodile, and it could throw a rope of burning liquid well over 100 yards, in short bursts, enough for around 80 separate gouts of flame. It was a weapon of terror as much as of destruction. Again and again, the record shows, a strong point that had fought hard against shells and bullets would surrender the instant a Crocodile put a ranging burst of flame near its opening, because the men inside understood exactly what was coming, and no soldier, however brave, wants to face fire poured through the slit of the box he's sitting in. That was the collection. Swimming tanks, flailing tanks, dustbin-throwing tanks, bridge-laying tanks, matting-laying tanks, fire-throwing tanks. Now widen the lens, because the real question is not what these machines were. It is why Britain could produce them and Germany could not. And the answer is not that the British were cleverer or braver or better engineers. The Germans built the Tiger tank, a machine so formidable that Allied crews learned to dread the mere rumour of one nearby. They built the 88mm gun, perhaps the finest artillery piece of the war. They built the standardised concrete forts of the Atlantic Wall itself, engineering of a very high order. German engineering was superb. That is not in question, and any honest telling of this story has to say so plainly. The difference was not skill. The difference was structural, and it was cultural, and it lay in what each system was willing to hear. German military research and development flowed through great state and corporate hierarchies, and through a chain of command that ran up to a small handful of powerful men, and finally to Hitler himself. It was driven by specification. It produced brilliant answers to clearly defined questions. But it did not easily make room for the awkward outsider, the man with a strange idea that fitted no existing program, the sacked general, the foreign inventor tinkering with canvas and compressed air. There is a reason the swimming tank came from a Hungarian engineer working with British firms, and the whole freakish division came from a general his own army had reduced to a lance corporal. And this is the point where the story could so easily tip into flattery. So let me be careful, because the fairest version of this argument is also the truest. Germany was not short of brilliant outsiders or original minds. It produced men who built working jet engines, and early computers, and rockets that reached the edge of space. Ideas quite as strange and as far ahead of their time as anything on those beaches. The difference was never that the Germans lacked the genius. The difference was in what each system did with genius once it appeared. In Britain, the same loose, informal, faintly amateur culture that had always found room for the country parson who studied insects, or the retired officer who bred flowers, or the tinkerer with a shed full of half-finished experiments, also found room just often enough for the discarded general and the foreign engineer. There was even a word the wartime scientists and airmen used for such a person, the boffin, the clever, slightly odd civilian working in the seam between pure science and the hard practical needs of war. Britain was full of boffins, and, crucially, its stiff and snobbish institutions could occasionally be embarrassed, or persuaded, or gone around, so that a boffin's idea reached the men who could act on it. Hobart got back into the room because a newspaper article shamed the establishment and a Prime Minister wrote a letter. The German system, for all its power, ran through fixed hierarchies and a few jealous men at the top, and it did not bend the same way. A good idea from the wrong person, at the wrong level, in the wrong office, simply did not travel. That is not a failing of the soul. It is a failing of structure, and structures, not souls, are what this story is really about. If your father, your grandfather, or your great-uncle served in the 79th Armoured Division, in the Royal Engineers, in the tank regiments that crewed these machines, or on those beaches in any role at all, I would be honoured if you would put their name and their unit in the comments below. These stories survive because families keep them alive, and because people say the names out loud. In the darkness before dawn on the 6th of June, 1944, the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled stood off the coast of Normandy. 5 beaches had been chosen and given code names. In the west, 2 American beaches called Utah and Omaha. In the east, 3 beaches assigned to the British and Canadian armies, called, from west to east, Gold, Juno, and Sword. It is on those three eastern beaches that the funnies would do their work, and to understand what they achieved, you first have to understand a decision the Americans made months earlier, because that decision is the great natural experiment at the heart of this story. The British had offered to share the funnies. Field Marshal Montgomery, who was overseeing the land forces for the invasion, and who happened by an odd twist to be Percy Hobart's brother-in-law, having years earlier married Hobart's sister, made the full range of the specialised armour available to the Americans. Here we have to be careful and honest, because a myth has grown up around what happened next, and this channel does not deal in myths. It is often said that the Americans arrogantly refused all of Hobart's funnies and paid for it in blood. That is not true, and the truth is more interesting. The Americans did not refuse everything. The senior American commanders, General Eisenhower and General Bradley, were genuinely impressed by the swimming tanks, and they took them. American forces used the swimming Shermans on both their beaches. Bradley went further, and early in 1944 he actually asked for a substantial number of the swimming tanks, along with flails and as many as 100 of the flame-throwing crocodiles. What defeated the idea was not pride. It was time and industry. The bunker-breaking tank, the flail and the crocodile were all built on the British Churchill hull, a vehicle the American Army did not use, did not maintain, and had no supply chain for. To adopt them, the Americans would have had to retrain crews and mechanics and build a whole separate system of spare parts, and there simply was not time before the invasion. Bradley himself later wrote, in effect, that had the funnies been designed a little earlier, so that their gadgets could have been fitted to the Sherman tanks the Americans already used, his forces would very probably have taken them. So the Americans went in with the swimming tanks and their own armoured bulldozers, but without the flails, the engineers' demolition tanks, and the crocodiles. Remember that, and watch what it cost. Now watch the sea, because the sea is about to break the swimming tanks' one great weakness across the Americans at Omaha. The plan called for the swimming tanks to be launched from their landing craft some distance out, and to swim the rest of the way in, arriving at the shoreline just ahead of the infantry. But the sea on the morning of the 6th of June was rough, far rougher than the calm water the canvas screen had been designed for. Waves ran to 5 and 6 feet, and off Omaha Beach, the crews of one American tank battalion were launched into that heavy sea about 6,000 yards out from the shore, more than 3 miles. It was a fatal choice. The screens could not cope with the swell. Wave after wave poured over the canvas, and the tanks began to founder and go down one after another, dragging many of their crews with them. Of the 32 swimming tanks launched or carried by that battalion, 27 were lost. Only 2 managed to swim all the way in under their own power, and a small handful more reached the beach, only because the crew of one landing craft, seeing the catastrophe unfold, refused to launch and instead drove them directly onto the sand. Here again we have to kill the myth, because it is also said that all of the American swimming tanks sank, and that too is false. On the other American beach, at Utah, where the water was more sheltered and the tanks were launched much closer in, 28 of 32 swimming tanks reached the shore safely and did exactly what they were meant to do. The lesson of Omaha was not that the swimming tank was useless. The lesson was that it had to be used the right way, in the right conditions, launched close in when the sea was rough. And the deeper lesson, the one that runs through this whole story, is that at Omaha the infantry who came ashore had almost none of the specialised armour to help them. No flails to clear the mines, no engineers' tanks to blow the sea wall and the strong points, no crocodiles to burn out the bunkers. They had to cross that terrible beach and break those defences very largely with the courage and the flesh of men on foot, and Omaha became the bloodiest beach of the day, with something like 2,000 casualties. Now turn to the British and Canadian beaches, and watch the difference the machines made, because the difference was not simply that the funnies were present, it was that they had been trained to work together, in a precise and practiced sequence, like a piece of grim choreography. The plan broke each beach into a set of lanes, and to open each lane a mixed team of the specialised tanks went in together in a fixed order. The flails led, beating their lanes through the mines while the shells fell around them. Close behind came the engineers' tanks, blowing the seawall, filling the ditches with their bundles of brushwood, laying their matting across the soft clay, dropping their little bridges across the gaps, hurling their flying dustbins at the concrete. The swimming tanks, where they had made it ashore, gave covering fire with their guns from the water's edge. And only then, up the cleared and marked lanes the machines had opened, came the infantry and the rest of the armour pouring inland through gaps that on any earlier beach in this war would have taken hours and rivers of blood to force. It did not always go to plan. Machines were knocked out, lanes were blocked, teams improvised under fire, but the essential idea held. The beach had been turned from a wall into a series of doors, and the men who built and crewed the funnies were the ones who kicked those doors open. On Sword Beach, in the east, the swimming tanks of a cavalry regiment were launched, and most of them made the swim and crawled up out of the surf firing. Behind and among them came the flails and the engineers' tanks. The mine lanes were beaten clear, the obstacles were blown. Within the first couple of hours, several cleared lanes had been opened off the beach and inland, cut by the specialised armour and the assault engineers working together. A great German strongpoint the Allies had code-named Hillman, which was the headquarters of a German infantry regiment, held out much longer into the evening because it lay well inland. But the beach itself, the thing Rommel had staked everything on, the thing that was supposed to stop the invasion at the water's edge, had been torn open in the first morning. Later in the day, the one German armoured division within reach, the 21st Panzer Division, launched a counterattack toward the sea through the gap between the British and Canadian beaches and very nearly reached the coast, but it drew back at the sight of a vast fleet of gliders passing overhead in the evening light, and the moment was gone. On Gold Beach in the centre, the swimming tanks were launched late and close, only a few hundred yards out, because the officer in command judged the sea too rough to risk the long swim. It was a wise decision, though even so some were lost. But it hardly mattered, because on Gold the flails and the engineers' tanks had already got ashore and were already at work, beating lanes through the mines and blowing the guns and the strongpoints, so that by the time the swimming tanks touched the sand, the worst of the German defences in that sector had already been silenced by the other funnies. And it was on Gold Beach that the single most celebrated act of individual courage of the entire day took place. A soldier of a battalion of the Green Howards, a company sergeant major named Stanley Hollis, 31 years old, came ashore in the assault, and over the course of that day he did things that almost defy belief. It is worth pausing to notice how his day began, because it ties straight back to the machines. Ahead of his company lay a dense belt of mines, and it was the assault engineers who opened the gap so that Hollis and the men behind him could follow a line of white tape through ground that would otherwise have killed them. The funnies and the engineers cleared the path. What Hollis did with it was his own. Beyond the minefield lay the German battery on higher ground, and its pillboxes were tearing into the advancing infantry. Hollis saw the position doing the most damage and simply charged it, firing his submachine gun from the hip as he ran. He reached the pillbox, climbed onto the top of it, threw a grenade in through the opening and took the survivors prisoner, then followed a communication trench to a second bunker and cleared that one as well, more or less alone. By doing so, he stopped his company from being cut down by fire from behind and opened the way off the beach. Later the same day, in the village of Crepon, his company ran into a concealed German field gun. 2 of his men became trapped in a house under its fire. Hollis picked up a light machine gun and went forward alone, in full view of the enemy, deliberately drawing their fire onto himself so that the 2 trapped men could get clear. For these 2 separate actions on the same day, Stanley Hollis was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for valour in the British honours system. His citation, published that August, spoke of the utmost gallantry and made clear that it was largely through his heroism that his company took its objectives, and that its losses were not far worse. He is the only man awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on the 6th of June itself. He was decorated by the King in October of that year. He survived the war, later kept a pub, and died in 1972. By the evening of the 6th of June, the men Hollis fought alongside had pushed further inland than any other Allied unit on the whole invasion front. Some miles from the sand they had landed on that morning. That fact, on its own, is the quiet refutation of the entire German plan. Rommel had promised his staff that the invasion would be decided in the first hours at the water's edge. On the eastern beaches, those first hours had come and gone, and instead of a wall of dead attackers on the sand, there were cleared lanes, captured bunkers, and British and Canadian columns already moving into the fields beyond. The beach had not held for a day. In many sectors it had not held for 2 hours. On Juno Beach, the beach in between, largely the responsibility of the Canadian Army. The same pattern held, and here too the machines were paid for in the men who crewed them. The Canadian swimming tanks of one regiment were launched, one squadron from well out and one from much closer in, and of the 19 swimming tanks of the squadron that landed at Courseulles, 14 reached the shore. That single regiment lost 22 men killed and 21 wounded on that one day. And in the assault on Juno there is one machine and one crew, whose story stands for all the rest. An engineer's tank, one of the Churchill demolition vehicles, was trying to get the assault off the beach near the village of Grey-sur-Mer when it came to a flooded gap, a culvert filled with water, and as it tried to cross it foundered and went in. 3 of its crew were killed, a lance sergeant named Ashton, and 2 sappers named Manley and Batson. The tank sank into the soft ground and was, in time, simply pushed aside and buried, and a bridge was built over the very gap it had died trying to cross, and the vehicles of the invasion drove over the top of it and inland. Years after the war, that tank was dug out of the ground, restored and set up as a memorial, and it stands near that beach today, a 50-ton headstone for the men who did not come back from crossing one small flooded ditch on the morning of the 6th of June. By the end of that day, the German division holding the eastern beaches had been shattered. Its commander, Wilhelm Richter, the man we met at the very beginning, would report afterward that of the thousands of men who had held that coast, only the equivalent of a single battalion, and that at reduced strength, remained fit to fight when the fighting was done, and that the great majority of his division's artillery had been destroyed or captured. When Richter looked back on that day, years later, in an account he wrote for his former enemies, he did not and could not deny what the tanks had done. He wrote of the swift advance of numerous enemy tanks, of his artillery being put out of action, of a defence that had, in the sector where the strange machines came ashore, simply fallen apart. The 3 beliefs had all failed at once. The tanks had swum, the minefields had been crossed in minutes, the concrete had been broken from the beach, and the professional soldier Rommel had trusted to hold the water's edge on the decisive first day was left to account for a defeat that everything in his training told him should not have been possible. So the question the title asked has its answer. German beach defenders could not explain the strange British tanks, because those tanks were the product of something their own system did not contain, a tolerance for the outsider that let a sacked general and a foreign inventor and a pile of ludicrous-looking machines reach the decks of the invasion fleet. It is easy to turn that into a cheap boast, and it should not be one. The Germans were not inferior engineers. The soldiers in the casemates who fired at the swimming tanks until the canvas dropped were professionals doing their duty, and many of them fought with great skill and courage, and many of them died at their guns. The verdict here is not about the quality of men on either side. It is about the shape of the systems they served inside. Britain was not a better organised country than Germany in 1944. In many ways it was worse organised, slower, more prone to muddle. But that same muddle, that same reluctance to throw a gifted, awkward man entirely away, was the exact crack through which Hobart climbed back, and through which the whole strange enterprise reached the beach. The British were not superior. They were, in one particular and unglamorous way, lucky in how their system failed, and they were unlucky in the cost, as everyone was that day. The eastern beaches where the funnies did their work were taken at a lower price than they might have been, and a far lower price than Omaha, where the machines were largely absent. But the whole day still cost the Allies something like 10,000 casualties, of whom more than 4,000 were killed, and German losses ran into several thousand more, and every one of those figures was a man. Let me leave you with what became of the people in this story, because their lives did not end on that beach, and their endings are worth knowing. Percy Hobart, the general his own army discarded and then could not manage without, lived to see his funnies vindicated beyond argument. He stayed in the army a little longer, oversaw the further development of specialised armour, then retired, and he died in 1957. He never became a household name in the way that the commanders of great battles did, which is a strange fate for a man whose invention saved so many lives on the most watched morning of the century. Nicholas Straussler, the engineer whose canvas screen taught a tank to float, kept working and kept inventing after the war. He held patents in a range of fields and he lived until 1966. It is worth remembering that of all the funnies, his swimming tank was the one even the Americans wanted. The one idea in the whole collection that crossed every beach on that day, on both the British and the American sides of the invasion. Wilhelm Richter, the German commander who could not explain the tanks, survived the war and lived into the 1970s, and it is partly because he set down his account for his former enemies that we can hear the other side of that morning in his own measured, professional words, an officer trying honestly to explain a defeat rather than to excuse it. Stanley Hollis, the sergeant major who won the only Victoria Cross of the 6th of June, went home to Yorkshire and in time became the landlord of a pub, and by every account carried his fame lightly, a modest man who had done something extraordinary on one extraordinary day. He died in 1972, and the medal he won is cared for now so that people can still stand in front of it and think about what one man did on one beach. The 79th Armoured Division itself, the strangest formation in the British Army, the division that never once fought as a division, was quietly disbanded in the summer of 1945, its job finished, its bull's head badge folded away into history. Its true legacy was not a single famous battle, but a simple idea that outlived it. The idea that you can build a specialised machine for a specialised problem, and that ingenuity applied to engineering can save the lives of the men you would otherwise have to spend. I owe you one piece of honesty before this ends, because accuracy is the whole point of what we do here. The German machine gunner at the very start of this story, the man watching the shapes come out of the sea, is not a single named individual whose diary we happen to possess. He is a faithful reconstruction of what the defenders in those bunkers genuinely experienced that morning, drawn from the documented behaviour of the swimming tanks and from the accounts of men on both sides who were there. The phenomenon was real. The tanks that looked like boats and then unfolded into tanks were real. The confusion was real. Wilhelm Richter, the commander at the end, was entirely real, and so were his words about the tanks that broke his division. Everything the machines did in this story they did. Where the historical record is uncertain, as it is with the exact count of swimming tanks that reached each beach, careful historians still disagree, and I have tried to tell you where those disagreements lie rather than pretend to a precision that does not exist. Subscribe if you would like the next of these, because there are more inventors the establishment rejected and then could not do without, more strange machines that broke assumptions nobody believed could be broken, more men, on every side, whose names deserve to be spoken out loud rather than left to sink into the ground like a tank in a flooded ditch. The strange tanks came out of the sea on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, and the men who built them and crewed them and died in them changed forever what a defended beach could be. Some of them have descendants who are watching this now. Some of their names may already be in the comments below. Say them, and they do not disappear.